Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I'm so glad everyone could join our 5th webinar session. And this is hosted by CSD Core, Curriculum, Outreach, Resource, Education, Training. So that's Core. And my name is Jack, and I will be the host for this webinar. And this core webinar series, we've decided to host because of COVID. We're here at CSD and we typically provide trainings for interpreters of deaf programs in Northern California. But since COVID, we have a wealth of resources that we needed to share, but we decided to do it through a webinar, and it has been very beneficial and successful because nationwide, everyone can have the same benefits, the same information, and exchange the same information through outreach. And so we've decided to continue that with the second year. And our topic that we are talking about today is navigating your family rights and the best practices for your deaf child. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Lily Benedict and Laura T. Peterson. They're the family education coordinators under CORE, which is part of the outreach team. Now, Laura is focused on ages 0 to 5, and Lily is 6 and older. So I appreciate both of them joining us, and we will have a Q&A. If you do have a question, type your question under specifically Q&A, and you can use the chat. That's more of like, if you want to say something like, oh, yes, I agree, something like that. But Q&A is specifically for questions. So we will get to that at the end. We will have a Q&A session, and that's when we will open that up and we'll look at all the questions, and I will translate those and read them, and then we will respond. So it's possible that the time will run out, but don't worry about that. For the questions we don't get to, we will type those out and we will send the question and response, and we will include that in a recording, a voiceover. So we've got that all planned out. Now, before I'm going to leave, but before I do that, we do have a Spanish interpreter joining the call. So that means that we will do a lot of pacing, turn taking, and the Spanish interpreter, I want to make sure that those who have Spanish families, Spanish speaking families, can click on the global interpreting icon. There's a button, and if you click that, you will only hear the Spanish interpreter voicing for us. Okay. And I really hope you enjoy this webinar. Thank you so much. Bye. Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Hi everyone. Does everyone see that word deaf? And why did we put a star there? That means that applies to a full range of hearing loss or hearing levels, whether it be mild or moderate or profoundly deaf, using devices, hard of hearing individuals, deaf blind individuals, deaf with other disabilities. So it's all one umbrella that we're using the term deaf for. Okay, thank you for coming. We are going to try to cover everything, all of these topics, some more in depth than others. And this PDF will be, this presentation will be distributed through PDF. So you can take this home and review it for your next IEP or FIEP meeting. So just know that some of those, some of the slides have a lot of information. So we're not going to be able to cover everything, but you can take that home, and it's just nice to have for your review. So we will cover some of the terminology. Sometimes when you enter an IEP, people are talking, you might not understand what's being discussed. So we'll cover some of that. And if you have specific questions about specific terminology, let us know and we will address that at the end of the presentation. We will discuss IDEA and what is deaf education compared to special education. School placement, what the different types of school placement are. Academic achievement. And importantly, your rights as a family during that meeting, okay? And so this terminology, when we have, I'm sorry, one second, Lily, hold on just 1 second. It seems like some people are not able to see us. So we're going to try to resolve that. Okay, Lily, let's go back just a minute. Okay, start over from where you were. Okay, so this word deaf, I just wanted to expand on that term deaf. It can be applied to a lot of terms under an umbrella. There's different hearing levels: mild, moderate, severe, profoundly deaf. So there's a range of, deaf blindness, hard of hearing, deaf with other disabilities, children with hearing aids or cochlear implant. That's all encompassed in that terminology, in that term deaf. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now we will try to cover a lot of information, and some will be more in depth and some is just a little bit. So we will be sharing this PDF of this presentation so you can have that to review for your next IEP and kind of read over that. So don't feel like you need to take notes. We will be sharing this information. And we will discuss some of the terminology. Some of it's maybe a little bit confusing, and we're just going to try to clarify some of that today. So we will explain what IDEA means, that law, and what is the difference between deaf education and special education. Also, different types of school placement. And what academic achievement is for deaf students. And importantly, your rights as a family in the IEP meeting. Okay. Now, if you see this terminology, this little colorful slide, as a mother of a deaf daughter, I have been going to IFSPs and IEPs while she's grown up. And some of this terminology can be challenging, overwhelming, confusing. So we're going to try to touch on some of this terminology to explain, okay? Now, if you notice, the IEP is labeled as, there's a definition of disability and your right to know, and what deafness / hearing impaired, that label, deaf experts agree to use the word deaf because that's all inclusive. No matter the hearing level, no matter if you use devices, it's all deaf. The word hearing impaired is offensive and is looked at as derogatory and has a negative connotation. So we don't use that term. The disability label of hard of hearing, there's measurements, and there's not a measurement specifically about hearing levels that differentiates hearing versus hard of hearing. They don't have, there's no research and no specific decibel level that would differentiate the two groups. And the reason that I want to add that the reason that that is important is because often they will offer your child, say hard of hearing, so you don't need these services. So don't accept that if that's what you're offered. Now, the disability label, there's deaf blind, and we use that is an appropriate term, deaf blind. The first disability listed is the primary disability, being deaf, and the secondary is blind. And the reason for that is because they need access to language through sign, and that may be tactile interpretation, that might be fitting text or signs to their sight space, and so on. If you might notice in the IEPs, they have these terms, speech or language delayed. And that does not apply to the deaf group. That's, it's just deaf blind, hearing impaired. I'm sorry, not hearing impaired, language. So that doesn't, those are two different groups. Yeah, just to clarify, speech and language delay is not applicable to deaf students, period. So we've seen that, but that's not right. The point is to focus on their accessible, their language accessibility. Okay, when families first enter with the babies and they're identified as deaf, they start with IFSPs, that's Individual Family Service Plan. And that is for families with babies at age 0 to 3. And the idea is to provide support, information, resources, how to make sure the child gets access to language, and you should receive home visits, somebody coming out once a week, twice a week, sometimes once a month, but you can say, I want once a week or whatever fits. Unfortunately, during COVID, a lot of home visits did not occur. So families, were very stressed with the children at home. So, or the home visits had to be through Zoom or video, and it's just really not equal access. It's not the same as being in person, especially with like a baby. But you do have a right to access that service. And when the baby is 18 months old, they can go to play groups if your area provides for that. So, and it's a maximum of 9 hours a week. Some of those include other kids with other disabilities, not necessarily all deaf. And at CSD, we offer play groups, and that's on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday mornings, and that's open to all. So just to let you know, it does not matter where you live. Now, when the baby becomes 3, then they would transition to individual education plans. That's IEP. And from the age of 3 on to age 22, that's the age range that we provide services for. It's important, the IEP will document what kind of services, what the school district will provide, the home district will provide, the curriculum, and it's very specific. All, the audiograms, the different hearing levels, the decibel loss, anybody who has an audiogram proving that qualifies for services. And in IEP, that's very important because families have legal rights to demand certain services. You know, if the school's not doing well, they have a right to ask for those services. Now, what we have noticed in the past is that some school districts, not all, but some school districts will say, oh no, you know, your kid's doing great. They're so good. They're doing great. You know, they're on grade level. You know, at age 3, you know, that they might say, oh, you don't need a graduate to an IEP. You can just have a 504. But that is not appropriate for deaf students, because deaf students will always be deaf. So often if kids have a unilateral hearing, they can hear out of one ear but deaf in the other ear, the school will say, oh, no, they're fine. They don't need this. Just put them on a 504. But that's not right, because research shows that there is a delay, and that will impact them later in their academic experience as they get older and they develop language and it becomes more complicated. If you let go of the IEP, it's hard to get that service back. Okay. Now, if you notice, different programs mention services they offer, what things that they use. There's a term called total communication. Another is simultaneous communication or signing exact English. Or it might say LSL, that means language spoken. I'm sorry, we'll see in the, and you'll see those modes of communication. Now, those modes are not considered language. Those are tools and modes of communication. So just keep that in mind, that the California Department of Education says that those are not recognized as language. And so you will see that later. If you see that manual communication, that means, you use your hand, but it does not include the idea of language. So there are different methods, different tools for education in the classroom, but they are not considered languages. Now, you see these two sentences, American Sign Language and English, these two categories, and both have their own syntax, meanings, different language aspects, and those are separate. For example, in other countries are similar, like in Italy, they have an Italian spoken language and an Italian sign language. So it's the same here. So it's an important foundation. If a child understands ASL, they can apply that to learn English, and it's a bridge to developing their reading and writing skills. So the IDEA law really started in 1975. And that started from PL 194-1492. But so there have been some changes over the years since that time. But we're going to cover some of these now, the most important parts of the IDEA. Now, FAPE, FAPE. If you see that word, that means free and appropriate public education. And that means that the schools are responsible for providing education services that apply to their child in order to make them successful. And it is at no cost. It is the school's responsibility. Now, if your child is deaf and you're not sure what to do and you don't know what your rights are, I will show on this page. These are safeguards and procedural procedural safeguards. And in every IEP meeting, you if you notice, they give you that paperwork. You can waive your right to that or have it sent electronically. But if you look at page 2, that's what is shown here. If your child is deaf or hard of hearing or deaf blind, it explains that every IEP meeting, they must inform you that California School for the Deaf is an option. There's one in Northern California in Fremont and in South California in Riverside. The North location has a blind school set right next to the deaf school as well. And every IEP meeting, they must inform you that that school is available for your student to go to. And they recognize the school as LRE, the least restrictive environment. And we'll explain a little bit more about that term in a minute. If you have any concerns about these issues, you can contact Julie Rems. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name, and it's on this slide, and you can contact her for more information. Okay. One important part of the IDEA is appropriate. This is hard for deaf and hard of hearing kids because, especially here in California, because there's over 1,000 school districts. And we know that not a lot of deaf kids, often they're the only deaf person in that area. And so does each school district have the skills to evaluate for deaf kids and have an appropriate match for their education? So the IDEA says that they need assessments by someone who is knowledgeable. And if the school district does not have that person, they need to refer them to the School for the Deaf or the Diagnostic Center. One challenge, especially if you're evaluating young children, they may be shy, or often young kids, their signing is not very clear. And so it's important to ask who is doing the evaluation. Can they understand my child? Can they understand where their language is? So we're going to look at IEP. It says individualized. So I want to emphasize that term. That means your child as a person, as an individual, and what would fit them specifically. The meeting, and during the IEP meeting, you have people who are putting in ideas and what would fit the child's needs and for success. And sometimes the team will say, oh no, your child is doing fine, they're meeting their goals, everything's fine, just keep going. But it's important to look at those goals and make sure that they are challenging for your student. And it's important to check and just ask questions to make sure that the goals are appropriate. What have they learned? What are they being challenged on? And again, individual to meet your child's need. Yeah, sometimes parents will say, oh no, my kid's doing fine in school. And the teacher will say, oh no, yeah, they're meeting their goals. But are the goals at grade level, or are they lower than grade level? So that's something to think about. Okay, now this term, least restrictive environment, LRE, we're going to explain a little bit more as we go in later slides. But in the special education environment, they view that as children with different abilities, different disabilities. It must be local, close to your home. It must be in mainstream classes, inclusive of all children. So that's the idea there. And what we envision for deaf students in special education programs, I'm going to show you a slide here. So your child may be in a mainstream program close to your home. You may receive additional services like interpreting services or an FM system or CART, which is the captioning service, written notes, and all of those together. The question is that the least restrictive environment for your student? And the answer is no, it's not. It is not the least restrictive environment because we're going to explain that on the next slide. So the IDEA was updated and has additional information specific to deaf students in 2004. And that's important because some people don't realize that. It says the IEP must consider, the team must consider what the child's, the student's language and communication needs are for developing and growing and learning. Do they have direct communication with their classmates, with their peers, with the teachers and other professionals? Do they have direct instruction in their language? Those things are things that they have added to clarify what the least restrictive environment means for deaf students. And she mentioned some special factors, and we have some more here. It is important to consider if the child is on grade level with their peers in the same age group, same language. So you have to look at these factors and see if they are, maybe mixed grades or different languages. So that's very important to consider that the child needs full access to the same age group, same language, so that they can develop. This is a critical mass. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about this. This is the placement, whatever placement, we want to make sure that there is direct communication, sign to sign, voice to voice, etc. So what does critical mass mean? That means a significant number of similar peers. So not just one or two students, but many. The fact that they can look up to a deaf role model and say, oh, I can do that. That's very important. Not just one or two, but several. So that provides for an opportunity of social learning, emotional development, and all of the people using the same language. Now, there are plenty of opportunities for leadership roles that the students can be involved in when there's a critical mass. And that includes sports, different hobbies, feeling at home, feeling safe, so that their learning can thrive. Also incidental learning, that means just kind of like looking at the teachers and the staff and their conversations with each other, and students have incidental learning through watching language. So critical mass is very important. Now, the California Educational Code has added more information for deaf students in California. The additions say that it's important that their unique sorry, 1 second. I'm going to give the interpreter just a second. Okay, let me repeat that. California Educational Code also says that the deaf children, their students, their unique communication modes must be respected. And I have a challenge with that sentence because what is unique communication? Remember, Lily spoke about LSL, listening and speaking language, spoken language, C, signing exact English, total communication. So all of those modes are not language. California currently does not recognize communication modes. They recognize ASL and English for teaching deaf students in the state of California. So they did add some clarifications, and there's a document that says families have a right to know what the difference is between communication modes and tools and actual language. Language is English, ASL, Spanish. Those are examples. And families don't feel like they have to choose one. You know, I need to choose English only. No, that's not the case. Deaf students can be bilingual. They can be trilingual. So. And a new law that's just passed here is State Bill 5210, and that's 5 years ago. And they are now requiring early start education and teachers for kids 0 to 5. They have to look at and evaluate their language every 6 months and compare where they are at with their language development milestones. And the reason is because sometimes families are like, oh yeah, they can talk, or the student can talk, they can say one sentence, they can say doll, or, you know, that the kid is 3 years old, you know, they should have hundreds of words. So this is where we have those different milestones and the idea is to empower families by looking at, okay, this is where my kid needs to be or is supposed to be. And these milestones mean that if the kid is, has 3 languages, maybe they have some spoken English, some sign, and some spoken Spanish. Now you put down all of those languages, and all of those language count for their language development. And that term, inclusion, that's a really hot term right now, right? In special education. And the concept is good. The concept is right. The idea is that, like before, special education kids were kind of hidden away in the back of the school, you know, maybe in a portable somewhere. But the idea is that those children are, you know, inclusive in the right school and, you know, with their peers, and instead of being separated, and that is fine. But they assume that all students have access to the same language in that model. For deaf students, what that means is, for most deaf students, what that means is that they're missing a lot. People are talking, so they're just missing a lot of information if they're not looking. And so they have to ask to repeat, you know, I missed, what did you say? And they, you know, are constantly having to ask people to repeat themselves. They might feel bullied because, you know, and feel different. I'm less than because I can't catch everything, can't catch what everyone is saying. They might, you know, be embarrassed to sign. They might feel isolated. and what do they do during recess or lunch? Often the interpreters are not provided during those times. And the deaf students can be good at fooling teachers and parents. They can nod and follow along and use their visual cues to kind of find out what others are doing and follow, and with a smile on their face, and they want to please you guys. They want to fit in, but it's not the best learning environment. Teachers often will say, okay, now look at your book, and the deaf student's looking at the book and doesn't see what the interpreter is saying while the teacher is talking. And it's exhausting having to keep track of the interpreter and the book and the other conversations. It's very exhausting. And often the students will go home and try to just study to kind of make up for what they've missed during class. And that's not what students should be doing. So the point is that it ignores their strengths for their ability to learn visually. Now, for special education students, we don't include deaf students in that group. It's separate, because if they are included in that group, it's focused on deficits. Oh, your child can't hear. What do we do? Oh, your child can't speak. What do we do? And it's focused on the negative aspects. Oh, just put a hearing aid on them. Oh, they'll be fine. Put a cochlear implant on them and they'll be fine. And that's not the case. You see, Julie Rosemary, and she did some PhD research work, and one person was painting with faces. If you, I'm trying to describe this painting here, and the idea is that there's oppression coming from all sides, and expectations to fit in, and having to work so hard with the school system and make sure you're doing well in that environment, and mainstreaming, and having these pressures come from all sides. It can feel very oppressive. And that's not the deaf education model. That's a special education model. Now, deaf education, what is that? We are focused on deaf strengths, what they can do well. And we can look at how to teach in a classroom that fits their needs and make a very language-rich environment for the students. At the school, we follow the California Common Core program. Like if there's a curriculum for third grade, then we teach that curriculum to our third graders. Students take the state standard testing. We don't, the same as their peers. And they're included in a deaf community that's, very culturally rich. They know what the community is, and that deaf people can succeed and get all of that language and receive it, and so that they can work with their strengths. And the teachers at the school have high expectations that deaf children can do it, and encourage them to do so. Now the idea is the students have equal access with their peers. And the critical mass here looks very different. We use the student strengths. We teach history by showing what deaf people did in generations past, so that they can make a connection with that community. So that's very different than inclusion. This slide talks about deaf community cultural wealth. And there's two perspectives. There's sort of positive, and then what happens if you don't have that. So the advantages are deaf socialization, which is important for language development using ASL, and that can be applied to learning new information. And that just provides a language foundation to learn other things. And they can also look at different role models and have, good self-esteem and confidence. And when they graduate, they kind of know what to do and how to navigate life. They have those skills that they've learned, uh, and a better resistance to possible oppressions and self-advocacy. Um, when they have a family themselves, they have those skills that they can teach to their children. Now, if a deaf child does not have enough language exposure and does not have those experiences, the limited socialization, just a couple of friends, not a strong language foundation. So if that happens, the foundation is not there. And so they might look around and feel like, oh, I'm the only deaf person, and just kind of accept the struggle. And their navigational skills are very poor. They might have to be overly dependent on others. And when they become parents themselves, they may not have those skills and those tools to provide for their children. And those are, big gaps that are provided within the deaf community and the deaf culture. Yeah, I'm sure you've experienced this, Lily. A lot of parents will say, "Oh, California School for the Deaf, they're going to be alone. They're not going to have experience living in the real world," and that's not true. What they're saying is what we see in our own students who have all of these um, aspects included in their education is that they are confident in the outside world. So it's actually the opposite. As far as placement, there are different groups. You'll notice these terminologies: a regular classroom, inclusion, mainstream. And what do those terms mean for your deaf child? And so I want to, adding interpreting services, following certain curriculum. And a lot of times, typically the deaf and hard of hearing students are like, oh, you don't have to take that test. It's okay. And so there's no accountability for their learning. And sometimes maybe a deaf teacher, an itinerant teacher might show up, maybe like once a month to help the deaf child in their education. And so they have trouble communicating, and it's just very limited. There's not a whole lot of language access there. So it can be it can be the most restrictive environment for a child. And we're going to explain a little bit more about different school placements. I think, Lily, because of time, I think that we're not going to be able to touch on all of the placements, but you will be able to get this information. Okay. So again, for the different placements, special day classes, you can read over all of this in the slide. And if a student comes into class, for example, and there's mixed grades, first grade, second grade, sixth grade, it gets very confusing, and that does happen out there at some schools. And you can read more about this in the slides, and it can be a challenge for the teachers and to have that direct education for the students. The special day schools, the public schools, private schools, all of these different environments may focus on just speech and oral communication, or may partner with the hospitals and their cochlear implant programs. And so they may only focus on one aspect and not all of the aspects of learning and language, but you can read about that. At California School for the Deaf, like I mentioned, the California State Department recognizes this as a least restrictive environment because there are opportunities for direct instruction, direct communication with peers, leadership roles, athletics, art, drama. And so there's many opportunities. So we do follow the state's standards and their assessments. And the curriculum just comes into language, ASL and English. And the students here have an opportunity for the day school, the day school program or the residential program. And there are special education programs for those who have additional disabilities. And there are, so we do have a place in a curriculum for them. Yeah, we have to skip a lot of these because of time. So how are deaf students doing? One thing to keep in mind is in California, 90% of the families, 70% of the families don't use sign language with their students, with their children. And that children goes to school, that school does not use ASL for a large percentage. Now understand, language and cognitive ability is very connected. If the language is not there, that affects their ability to be successful in school. We did get one date and time in 2016 for mainstream different programs, not just here at CSD, for the whole state, and it was very discouraging. Only 18% of what the state categorizes as deaf, of those children are at grade level. And the people that they label as hard of hearing, only 35% are at grade level. So obviously, what most deaf students are receiving is not working. So one thing we're proud of at CSD is that we do all of the data. We have students take tests, and we have all of these regulations, make sure they're growing, and that's very important. And we are very lucky to have gotten a researcher from Rochester Medical Center and one from Boston University, and 3 of them came here and they studied 569 of our students, looking at their test scores. And what they found was, so the researcher would look at deaf students at CSD, here at CSD Fremont. And those students, there are 3 scores: math, science, and English. You see those 3 red lines on the graph? And those children are deaf, and they are at grade level. So that's good. Now the second graph here, what they found is really exciting. Students who started at CSD before the age of 3, you can see that dark blue line. So you have the deaf in the red, and then the deaf with hearing parents who started before the age of 3, they're pretty similar. They're at grade level. Now the last third box here, the light blue, indicates students who started after the age of 3. Maybe they don't start till middle school, but different ages, it's just after the age of 3. You can see that they're really lagging. They're not at grade level. They're very behind, many of them. So it's nice to finally have that research and that data. So we're very thankful to those researchers who have done that work. Okay, we also, like I mentioned, we have SBE 10, that data that's collected every 6 months for the babies ages 0 to 5, and getting those observations and that information. And the babies, that are maybe on track, and then as language progresses for like preschool after age 3, they may not be on track anymore. only 57% are at age appropriate levels. So that is concerning. Now, if your child maybe 0 to 3 transitions into IFSP, the ages 3 to 5, or maybe transfer to a different school, it's important to look at these meetings and what the transition plan is for maybe a different school or different goals or whatever. Remember, in your IEP, if you need a meeting, you have a right to bring someone with you to that meeting. So it could be an advocate from the deaf agency or anyone that you feel will be helpful. You can bring them, and it's important to let the team coordinator know, hey, I'm going to be bringing this person, ideally a few days ahead of time. And if an ASL interpreter is required, even further in advance for the IEP or IFSP meetings. Now, it's important that when you are in the meeting discussing all of this and you're ready to sign the papers, you are not required to sign right away, right there at the meeting. You can bring the information home, you can look over it, you can review it, and just kind of make sure that you're satisfied with the suggestions. And you may think that some of them are fine and agree with some of them, and some of them you may not. You want to change those, you can do that too. So if there's, for example, placement at a different school, we want to make sure that, suppose you just want to make sure that the dates of the service and the placement are correct and everybody is on the same page. If you look at the IEP and you disagree with anything, you're able to talk to the team and discuss that. And if it does not resolve, you do have due process. And so what you would do is you would write your disagreements out and make your position very clear, attach that to the IEP, and just remember that you do not have to sign if you don't agree. Now, when the school district lets you know that they're having an IEP meeting, make sure that you get that in writing, either an email or a paper, to tell you where, what time, all of that information, what the agenda is, and make sure that you communicate with them and save that paperwork. So just make sure that you keep everything documented, every communication. If you want to visit the school, for example, if you want to see, the elementary or the high school program or California School for the Deaf and make a visit, you can go ahead and visit. You don't have to have the IEP approve that visit. You are able to come anytime, visit the school, and then come back to the meeting and say, oh, I think I want my child to go there. Or, you can call a meeting at any time that you want. You don't need the team's approval. Yeah, I think it's important that the parents make informed decisions. So you can visit different schools, different programs. One thing I wanted to emphasize, you can't say, oh, I want my kid to go to that school. You have to say why. You have to say, because they have a strong language of peers, direct communication in ASL. They have social emotional opportunities. So those things, you really have to spell that out. You can't just say, I want them to go to this school. Right. I just wanted to add also, those of you who are deaf parents, I've seen many of you say, oh no, I don't need an IFSP, it's fine, and when they're 3, the kid, they expect them to just go into school, and that's not the case. You have to go through all the paperwork, do the IEPs. So the IFSP and the IEPs are for all families. Okay. Okay, I just wanted to make sure, that was a great presentation, and we see all these questions in the chat. The PowerPoint was great, and it really explains how you can support your children, and as teachers, how we can provide for your students in class. And this type of webinar, like I mentioned in the beginning, is part of an outreach webinar. And we're not going to just stop here. We're hoping that this leads to group discussion after this is hosted. We want all over the United States to have the same type of, we have the same type of challenges and problems, and, we need to discuss and resolve how we set up safeguards and how we deal with the IEPs. So I think I'm glad that we decided to do this webinar, and thank you for the presenters. And I see that the time has run out. There's only 2 minutes left. So I will quickly just ask, there's a lot of good questions. Like I mentioned in the beginning, your questions in the Q&A will be answered. And we will put a response together with those and record the answers with audio. And we will also translate that to a PDF, and you can keep that and look through that at any time. Anytime you want, we can have a national discussion about that, and just let me know about that, okay? First, I think we have 1 minute left. So the IEP, how would you determine disability? This is the primary and this is the secondary. How is that determined? Does anybody have an answer for that? Okay, so how that is determined is the team. The team will have the discussion. Suppose that a family who wants their child to go to the deaf school at CSD, their primary disability has to be deaf or hard of hearing. And if it's the other way around, if it's like speech and language, for example, and the second disability is hard of hearing, CSD is not able to accept that child. So it's a team decision that will be discussed in the meeting, and based on what the student needs to be successful in school. And I'm going to let Laura add something here. Oh, no, that's right. No, that's it. Okay, so I think our time has run out, and we're going to go ahead and take all of your questions and move them to a document. One thing that I did see, somebody asked if the PowerPoint will be translated into Spanish, and the answer is yes. Yes, we will have a Spanish document. We have Spanish speakers, Spanish translators right now, interpreters, and we will have a recording of Spanish spoken interpretation, as well as the translated document. Okay. Again, you two did a beautiful job presenting. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you for Juan, the Spanish interpreter, and Daisy for voicing for the two of us. Thank you so much. Okay, thanks. Have a good weekend, everyone, and thanks for joining. Bye.